Welcome to our journey of transformation. We have been studying the parables, the conversations, and the principles of Jesus, in which he teaches us how to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And we need these teachings so that we can continue to transform ourselves in the love of our Father. So now we're going to study a passage from Luke chapter 6, verse 27 and 28. Our study is entitled, "Do Good to Those Who Hate You." Luke chapter 6, verse 27 and 28. That's where Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you." Once when I was in Berlin, Germany teaching, I met a Syrian Christian who had fled to Germany as a refugee. He asked me what I was doing in Berlin, and I explained that I was writing a book on the teachings of Jesus about loving our neighbors as ourselves. The man was educated and trained as a dentist in his country. He was perceptive and serious, but quick to smile. Our conversation led to Jesus' teaching about loving our enemies. "That's a hard one," he said. He related some of his experiences of living in war-torn Syria, where Christians are a persecuted minority. He used to meet with fellow believers for worship in secret. His life in Syria was not much different from the lives of early Christians living under the threat of persecution from the Romans. They also met in secret. About loving his enemies, he continued by saying, "I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it." I was genuinely humbled by his sincerity and devotion. He inspired me. Most believers and even non-believers who know anything at all about the moral teachings of Jesus know that he taught his followers to love their enemies. While they might generally appreciate the moral teachings of Jesus, many commonly think that loving one's enemies is a bit extreme and should not be taken as seriously as other principles that he taught. What they do not realize is that the common thread that links all of his teachings about loving our neighbors leads us to love our enemies. It was no mistake or coincidence that led Jesus in his parable of the Good Samaritan to choose a Samaritan to be the hero of the story as the one who understood how to love his neighbor. And it was no mistake either for Jesus to leave us to assume that the neighbor, the one receiving love, was a Jew. Jesus' audience that day consisted of Jews, and the Samaritans represented at least their rivals, if not their enemies. Jesus told this parable specifically to a Jewish expert in the law of Moses to answer the question, "Who is my neighbor?" By narrating the parable to him, Jesus taught that our neighbors are not people defined by proximity to us or by common origins or interests. In fact, Jesus taught that we choose for ourselves who our neighbors will be by making the decision, motivated by love, to become a neighbor to someone who needs our care, even if we have nothing in common with the person. If our enemy is suffering, we could even choose to become a neighbor by deciding to care for him or her. But we think caring for our enemy would require a lot of love. But the truth, however, is that loving our enemies is not so much a question of how much love we have, but instead a question of what kind of love we practice. Becoming neighbors to our enemies requires the practice of unconditional love, a love that does not depend on the worthiness of the person loved or whether or not the person loves us in return. When the Samaritan loved the Jew by caring for his wounds and helping him to heal, the Samaritan asked no questions, but simply loved. He could not predict how this Jew would react. He did not know if this Jew hated Samaritans or simply tolerated them. He did not know if the man had any friends or family who might take care of him. He simply chose to come close to a Jew and become his neighbor by caring for him. Very good. We can observe that the Samaritan made this decision motivated by unconditional love. But how does this principle, love your neighbor as yourself, inevitably and logically lead to loving our enemies? To answer this question, we must pay closer attention to what Jesus taught about this principle. First of all, we understand the word love to mean to care for the welfare of another person. When the Samaritan loved the Jew, he cared for the Jew, healing him of his injuries. Love is a form of a compassionate desire for the well-being of others, that motivates us to heal, to feed, to encourage, and to lift up. We allow ourselves to feel what others are suffering as if it were happening to us and seek to relieve their suffering. We can imagine being obligated or even forced to care for someone against our will, but this kind of care would be without compassion and would not be love. Now, why does this principle include the phrase, as yourself? What does it add to the principle of loving your neighbor? It helps us understand exactly what to do to practice care for our neighbors. If we wonder what we should specifically do to care for them, we should think about what we do to care for ourselves. The way we love ourselves becomes the standard for loving our neighbors. We take care of our spiritual, emotional, and physical health. When we are injured, we seek healing for ourselves. We respect ourselves by never intentionally harming ourselves. We forgive ourselves when we make mistakes instead of wallowing in guilt. We try to understand ourselves, why we behave in certain ways and why we react to situations the way we do. We also know we need to be patient with ourselves, giving ourselves multiple chances to improve and progress. Interestingly, from the standpoint of a follower of Jesus, caring for oneself spiritually would include having the humility to sacrifice one's own needs to serve someone else's. The Samaritan also humbled himself, detouring from his trip, using his own resources, and sacrificing his time and emotions to serve the injured Jew. Humility is a necessary quality of our spiritual health. Now, when we fully understand how to care for ourselves in a healthy way, we will also know how to care for our neighbors. There are, of course, people who have an unhealthy love for themselves. According to their view of themselves, their needs have priority over anyone else's. They take great pride and have confidence in their accomplishments, believing they are smarter and more powerful than others. Comparing themselves to others, they are certain they are superior in multiple ways. They desire to be first, have the best, and have the most. But this is not the kind of love for oneself that can be the model for loving one's neighbors. In fact, a person who has this kind of self-centered self-love cannot love their neighbors with the same love. If they tried, they would defeat themselves because their neighbors would then have to become first and best and have the most. The Samaritan loved the injured Jew as he loved himself with a healthy self-love. He could imagine himself in similar circumstances, robbed, stripped of his clothes, beaten up, and left by the roadside barely alive. He knew that he would want someone to care for his injuries, so he immediately went to the injured man to help him heal. Now consider what we know so far. The way we love our neighbors should reflect how we love ourselves when we have a healthy love for ourselves. As long as we have this healthy love for ourselves, we will know how to love our neighbors. Furthermore, this healthy love for ourselves should never change with changing circumstances or conditions. Despite the circumstances we are in, despite what people think about us, and despite our resources, we still ought to continue to love ourselves. If we were to stop loving ourselves, stop taking care of ourselves, and even start hating ourselves, our treatment of ourselves would quickly lead to our own destruction. So we can conclude that our love for ourselves ought to be unconditional. We will always want to care for ourselves. In fact, we can imagine ourselves in the place of the injured Jew. Would we care for ourselves enough to allow our enemies, the Samaritans, to help us recover and heal? The answer should be yes. Or would we have so much resentment, even unmitigated hatred for our enemies, that we would refuse their help? That would be a lot of serious hate, and the hatred would end in our own destruction, dying from our wounds. In my counseling work at Juvenile Hall, I once spoke with a teenager, a member of one of two rival gangs in my community that violently fight over territory to sell drugs. He has a deep desire to change his life, and he is captivated by the noble life Jesus taught. So I asked him to imagine himself in the circumstances of the injured Jew in the parable of the Good Samaritan. I invited him to imagine himself lying on the sidewalk in his own town, bleeding from multiple knife wounds. How would he react if a rival gang member, who happened to have an unusual amount of compassion, saw him and came over to him to stop the bleeding and call for an ambulance? What would he feel? It would feel really weird, he said. But would he accept the help? Of course he would accept it. But then I asked him to imagine that he passes by a rival gang member who is lying on the sidewalk, bleeding from knife wounds. Would he help the rival? This time the young man thought for an even longer moment and finally said, "Yes, I guess I would." But then he added, as a quite honest self-reflection, "But I probably wouldn't do it unless one of them helped me first." This added thought represents conditional love. But as his faith in Jesus grows, he will come to love unconditionally, even those who hate us, because this is where Jesus wants to take us. But what do you think? No doubt you will never find yourself in such dramatic circumstances. Nevertheless, what will you do in the context of your own life? Will you choose to speak compassionately of someone who has previously slandered you? Will you choose to respond gently to someone who is angry with you? Will you forgive someone who continues to offend you? Will you show kindness to someone who has taken advantage of your kindness? Will you continue to be patient with someone whose habit is to aggravate you? It is for you that Jesus chose a Samaritan as the one who loved his enemy neighbor, the Jew, as he would love himself. Jesus is inviting you to love very differently than the way you have loved before. It is not so much a matter of how much love we have, but the kind of love, unconditional love, that moves us to care for even those who oppose us. And our enemies are not necessarily those who seek our destruction. They also include anyone who opposes us, has a conflict with us, or is jealous of us. When Jesus said to do good to those who hate you, the Greek word for hate in that cultural context could simply mean to love less. Do good to those who love you less than others love you. If we find it difficult to love those who love us less than others do, how will we possibly come to love our enemies who seek our failure or destruction? Unconditional love, even for our enemies, was the direction Jesus was taking us in from the very beginning with the parable of the Good Samaritan. It is also the thread that ties all of his teachings in the parables, conversations, and principles together. In each of Jesus' teaching moments that we have considered so far, it is unconditional love that is expressed through its qualities such as compassion, mercy, forgiveness, patience, and gentleness. If love is unconditional, then the qualities of love are also unconditional. The compassion the Samaritan practiced did not depend on the worthiness of the person he helped. The mercy Jesus showed to a Canaanite woman and her daughter did not depend on who they were or where they came from. The forgiveness of a king who relieved his servant of a debt equal to millions of dollars did not depend on who the servant was or how big the debt was. And the patience and the gentleness Jesus showed people who had been overwhelmed and crushed by their own mistakes did not depend on their first becoming perfect. Notice one more compelling lesson from the Good Samaritan. Loving our enemies does not depend on their first becoming our neighbors. The Samaritan became a neighbor to his rival by loving his rival while he was still a rival. We decide, because of unconditional love, to come close to our enemies by caring for them, even while they are still our enemies. We love our enemies in order to become neighbors to them. In the present passage we are considering, Jesus gave several practical examples of caring for our enemies as neighbors. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, that is, speak well of them. Pray for those who mistreat you. In the Old Testament book of Proverbs, written hundreds of years before the coming of Jesus, the writer gives some wise counsel. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. Proverbs 25, verse 21. When Jesus came, what once may have been wise counsel became the ultimate moral obligation when we truly love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And like my Syrian brother, perhaps we are not yet there, but we know the direction we are going, and the grace of Jesus and the strength of his Spirit will take us there. Now let's summarize what we've learned too about the qualities of love. First of all, of course, we've been thinking about unconditional love. It's to care for the welfare of another person without expecting anything in return or thinking about whether the person deserves our care. What does this principle teach about the practice of unconditional love? Loving our enemies and returning good for evil requires the same kind of unconditional love that we practice when we love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Forgiveness, too. It's to disregard an offense and treat the offensive person as if the offense never occurred. What does the principle teach about the practice of forgiveness? The reason for forgiving our enemies is not because they have changed their attitude toward us and become friends, but because we decide to love them as we love ourselves. There's humility. Humility is to lower ourselves, for example, by admitting our mistakes and serving the needs of others first. What does the principle teach about the practice of humility? Forgiving and loving our enemies requires a humility to put the needs of our enemies before any desire we might have for compensation, satisfaction, or vengeance. There's compassion. Compassion is to feel the suffering of another person deeply enough to want to relieve their suffering. What do we learn about the practice of compassion? Unconditional love allows us to feel the suffering even of our enemies and help find relief for them, despite suffering they may have caused us. Now, it's our turn to practice. Just as Jesus told the expert in the law, go and do the same. So here's two questions. Who are those that oppose you, criticize you, with whom you do not get along very well, or who are simply different from you and whom you would not call friends? What will you do to love these people as you love yourself before they even love you? And then think of how you have reacted impulsively to the treatment of evil people toward you. Since you realize offensive moments will happen again, plan ahead and consider what you will do next time to react thoughtfully with compassion, humility, and forgiveness. And while you struggle to love your enemies and make them your neighbors, may the Father's Spirit strengthen your spirit. God bless you.